Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dan Smith, Director of CIPRI.
Hello. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are, once again, and welcome to the second day of the Stockholm Forum on Peace and Development, co-convened by CIPRI and the Swedish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and put on together with 41 partner organizations. Today, with the second day, we have a session on climate change, the other crisis. And to kick us off with that, we're going to be hearing from Peter Eriksson, who's the Minister for International Development here in Sweden. Peter, you're very, very welcome. Good to see you here. Thank you for coming. And thank you for the cooperation in putting this whole thing on and moving it online so quickly. And after Peter has spoken, we're going to be having a discussion with an international panel, which I'll introduce you to them now. So there's Hanna, who is the Special Representative of the UN Secretary General to the African Union. There is Raychelle Omamo, who's the Foreign Minister for Kenya. There is Hindou Ibrahim, who is an advocate for the SDGs and a climate activist from Chad. And Margot Wallström, who is former Foreign Minister of Sweden and also former EU Commissioner for Environmental Affairs. And we'll be hearing from Peter in a moment, but before we do that, I actually have a question. I have a question for you. And it's a three-part question. It's one of our online polling questions, and it'll be coming up on your screens in a moment, I guess. So, three parts. Is the most important crisis of the day the pandemic, climate change? Is the most important crisis of the day the pandemic? Or the third option, I don't want to choose. And remember, the third option is not I can't choose. The third option is I don't want to choose. Option A, is it climate change? Is it climate? Option B, is it the pandemic? Option C, I don't want to choose. And we will get the results in, and then we'll be talking about those results a bit during the panel discussion, which will come after remarks from Peter Eriksson. Peter, over to you.
Oh, thank you very much. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear global friends, the free world and the open society as we know it has temporarily been shut down. Factories have had to close as global value chains have been severely interrupted. People have lost their jobs. And politicians and nationalistic agendas have pointed their fingers on someone else in the search for someone to blame when faced with the weaknesses of their own societies. This pandemic will not last forever, but its effects are hard and will be felt for years to come. This is the time for reflection on what is fundamentally important to human life. The other two major crises the world is facing, climate change and loss of biodiversity, will not be over for a few years. The effects are instead getting worse by year, and it will take us generations or centuries to overcome them. The scientists are clearly and repeatedly telling us that the time for humanity to change course is about to run out. This is therefore time to build back better. New investments will constitute the world that we will live in. We know that investments in fossil fuels are fundamentally wrong. Investments in destructions of our nature and future must have an end. It's also right time to stop subsidizing a destructive behavior. Our message has to be, make room for a better world and new generations to come. I believe that the youngsters, of whom many now are losing their first jobs, are expecting us to kickstart nothing less than an economic transformation for sustainability without precedent. Loss of biodiversity and climate are closely linked. The extensive use of pesticides in large agriculture fields with monocultures are devastating. Devastating for pollinators like bees and other insects, as for birds, mammals and the human race. The rate of species extinctions is unfortunately accelerating. We also know that the deforestation is a disaster. We see right now how the Amazonas is coming closer to the brink where the climate changes from rainforest to savanna. local and global effects on climate and wildlife that we have never seen before is at risk. Healthy forests and healthy oceans are a prerequisite for our daily breathing of clean air. We know that all the microbes that are too small for our eyes to see are cleaning the water and our air and are making our soils healthy. But when our economic systems work against all these helpful creatures that we are dependent on, we threaten human security. I'm convinced that it is by building an open society that is just, transparent, inclusive, gender balanced, and certainly with respect for other species and coming generations, that we can build a future that is sustainable. We can still prevent the worst by continuing to analyze and better understand the links between climate change, the loss of biological diversity, and human security. We can prevent future crises by building strong institutions, supported by a vibrant civil society, and by building a global trust and a common understanding that we are in this together. COVID-19 reminds us that the world is indeed in desperate need of a Green New Deal. The starting point of a Green New Deal is ambitious implementation of the 2030 Agenda and the Paris Agreement. The health of people is heavily dependent on a healthy planet. And I think we can agree that a need for a better future than being locked out into private kitchens and living rooms with a computer in the need and not being able to meet our elders or grandchildren physically is not the right thing. Sweden has a strong commitment through our bilateral and multilateral development cooperation to address climate change and biodiversity and to assist countries in building back greener, more resilient and more sustainable out of the COVID crisis. And now is the time to make room for a better world and new generations to come.
Peter, thank you so much. I'd like to pause there for a moment of online applause because I think that was a really moving, interesting, wide-ranging talk. It sets us off great for this panel discussion now. Let's sit down and join the panel, or let the panel join us, as the case may be. So, Peter, I want first of all to come straight to you, and then I'm going to come to the other panel members, the online panel members in turn. It seems to me that part of what you're saying is it's a philosophical point lying behind a range of issues then that have to be addressed in policy terms. And that philosophical point, if I'm right, is that we have somehow messed up our relationship with nature and forgotten that we are a part of nature and totally interlinked with the world around us. Am I reading you right?
Yeah, that's totally true. And we look so very closely also. Of course, this pandemic is a disaster also, and it's a catastrophe for a lot of people that are affected directly and also indirectly. And in many countries, the economic effects come first, and then we see maybe also the health problems. But we know that at the same time, the climate crisis goes on, and we have to get out of this course. And also the loss of biodiversity is affecting us in the long term. And I think we have a responsibility not only for the people that are here right now, but also for the generations to come. And that is a perspective we have to take.
Right. And I think if we now turn to the results from the online polling, which we can see, 61% saying it's climate change and as the most important crisis of the moment, and 29 or nearly 30% saying they don't want to choose. There's a need to handle one in the short term and one in the long term. So with all respect, nonetheless, for the importance of the pandemic, what this constituency is sort of saying is we must not lose sight of the long term. And so I wanted now, if I can come to you, Hanna, Tetteh, sitting in Addis Ababa, and I hope the connection between us stays strong and clear. and ask you a little bit how you see the UN taking on these issues of climate change and also the relationship with the pandemic, if at all possible, in its work in Africa, including, for example, in peace operations, but other contexts too.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon to everybody who's listening in and to my colleague panelists. From the perspective of the UN working in Africa, UN environment, and of course many other UN agencies, we see climate change as a threat multiplier. And especially when you look at the situation in the Sahel and in the Horn of Africa, that is very amply demonstrated. But regarding the COVID crisis and the climate crisis, one of the issues of concern is as follows. The response to COVID has started a conversation about debt relief, about ensuring that countries have the capacity to be able to respond. When we see the damage that is happening to economies across the world, the other challenge is that once you've made these decisions about debt relief, about assistance, about making sure that funding is available in order to deal with COVID, at what point in time do we begin to introduce in that discussion issues of climate change and building resilience and making sure that funding is available for that purpose as well? Because if we don't deal with those issues simultaneously, the challenge that we might find ourselves facing is that we would have had some space given for countries to be able to manage a COVID response, and then in the crisis that follows, there would not be the same kind of emphasis on a climate response. Now, I did mention that we see climate change as a threat multiplier. And when you look at the countries that are the most fragile and that have the challenge of the climate crisis to face on the continent, they are also some of the countries that are least capable in terms of generating adequate finance to be able to develop their nationally determined commitments under the Paris Agreement. And that was before COVID. Now you can imagine what happens after COVID. And so from our perspective, there are a couple of things that we would like people to begin to take into consideration as we have this conversation on the way forward. One, we do not treat COVID and the climate crisis as being mutually exclusive. We should learn from the COVID crisis that science is important, that facts matter, and that if you don't prepare in advance, when the crisis hits you, the challenge is that you are going to have a great deal of difficulty in being able to cope with it. We must also realize that the countries that are experiencing fragility now, especially when it comes to the impact of climate change, are going to be experiencing that fragility even more so than was previously the case. And therefore, this is the time that we need to be proactive in support to those entities. Then the other thing that I would like to put on the table is that when you look at the way in which climate change is impacting the African continent especially, if we don't begin to think of a climate response in the here and now, challenges are that a lot of the things that we've seen over the last couple of years, the migration challenge, the access to food, access to water, being able to deal with the crisis are going to get a lot worse. And just to give you an idea, in 1963, Lake Chad was about 25,000 square kilometers. Today, Lake Chad is about 2,500 square kilometers. What does that tell you about the impact on the communities around that space and what it does to them in terms of livelihood? So I would say that from our perspective, remember that it's a threat multiplier. Remember that we have to be able to build resilience now. Remember that this is the time not to think of the COVID crisis and the climate crisis as being mutually exclusive, but in supporting a financial response, let's support a response that also focuses on resilience. Because it is when we help to build resilience that we are going to be able to deal with the other crises that undoubtedly we'll find ourselves facing sooner rather than later. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hanna. And I think thank you so much for emphasizing the connection between the crises and the issue of resilience. Because I've long thought that if, as a community or a society or as an international community, we can be resilient to one thing, then we can be resilient to others as well. In some sense, resilience is an adaptable quality. It's a fungible quality. And that is what worries me about the COVID crisis, is that one has seen a deficiency of resilience, which is also therefore worrying about climate change, economic circumstances, peace and conflict issues, and so on. Can I turn to Raychelle Omamo, the Foreign Minister of Kenya, and ask you how you see this same set of issues playing out in your region, and what you think the government of Kenya and others can do in order to address them?
First of all, thank you for inviting me to this forum. I'm delighted to be able to engage with all the ladies on the forum. It's quite astonishing that we're all ladies, and that says something about the Stockholm Forum. For us, in the Horn of Africa and in the East Africa region, what we are seeing is threat convergence. We are seeing climate change merge with a health crisis, merge with a security crisis, terrorism, merge with a crisis that is climate change related, like locusts. And so what we're beginning to see in our region, and indeed in other parts of Africa, is the degree to which the state is being asked to mobilize and to prove its capability in dealing with a multiplicity of threats. The challenge for us on the continent is to try and ascertain, as we move forward, what are the critical components that states in our region need to have? What are the strengths that they need to have to be able to deal with threat convergence? It's not enough just to say that this is a climate change threat that's mixing up with the peace and security threat. We need to be able to be prepared for a combined onslaught on the capability of a state to maintain peace and security, to provide public goods to its people, and to be able to engage with other states in a manner that it is able to expand its ability to be sovereign. These are very, very critical questions for all African countries who are being threatened by climate change, being threatened by COVID-19, being threatened by terrorism, and so on. It is absolutely crucial that we begin to ask ourselves what capabilities states need, and those who come in to be of assistance to our continent need to know what type of technical assistance is needed. We also need to be able to accept, and this is something we're beginning to realize in a very spectacular way, that actually left on their own, many African countries are actually quite capable. In my country, suddenly out of the blue, people are making masks, they're making PPEs, they're making ventilators, things that we didn't think that we could do. So there's a latent capability there that we need to unlock. And as Africans, we need to begin to accept the truth that if left to our own devices, we can build self-reliance. The question is this: what kind of policies, what kind of relationships, what kind of alliances, what kind of a world do we need to live in that will be able to accelerate that reliance? If we're talking about industries that will be led by climate change in the future, we need to ask ourselves, to what degree will these new industries be driven by the ingenuity of the continent? Or are we going to receive them in the way we've always received information externally? I think what COVID-19 is showing us is that there is innovation in our continent. There is a degree of capability that we ourselves did not realize we had. But at the same time, we have to build an array of capabilities to be able to deal with the challenges that confront us. Importantly, we must start to think about issues of dependency. We must start to think about new lines of cooperation, new lines of engagement that will be able to build that resilience that Hanna is talking about. What we have seen on our continent is that we need to be able to understand what kind of early warning systems we need to put into place. What kind of industries do we need to be able to establish so that we can deal with threats like locusts and COVID-19 and so on? How do we prepare for a future in which Africa has a place of power in the world order as we see it? Those are the questions that we are asking ourselves. We are asking them from the perspective of peace. We're asking them from the perspective of climate change. And we are asking them from the perspective of health. There must be a place for our continent in this new world that we want to build up anew. What kind of a new world will it be for us? Living in these places that are challenged, but places where there is an innate capacity for people to engage in transformation.
Thank you so much. And I think that the question which you're asking, what kind of place in what kind of world, this is a question which can rightly be asked everywhere. Some rich and countries where people and governments have thought of themselves as being highly capable and able to give examples and models to the rest of the world are amongst those who are in some ways performing worst in the middle of the crisis of COVID and the pandemic. And I very much like the way in which you emphasize the convergence between different kinds of risks, because I think it's when risks cluster together and interact with each other, both that we see some of the greatest dangers, but also we can see some of the greatest possibilities for action. I move now to Hindou Ibrahim, SDG activist and SDG advocate, and climate activist. And let me ask you how you think it's, well, first of all, what the experience of these issues is on the ground from your perspective, but also what the movements with which you're engaged, how they are addressing this seemingly changing world that we're living through at the moment.
Thank you very much, and hello everybody. It's really a great pleasure and honor to be with all of you. As Raychelle said, having women's panels, and of course, don't forget the man who spoke before. So I'm coming from a nomadic communities in Sahel, and yes, climate change is today the other crisis, because the COVID crisis is the top priorities. And I would like to tell you why I'm terrified. I'm terrified by both consequences of those crises in my community, because today COVID is hitting my country, Chad. We do have some cases, even if we don't know how much. Our country has a fragile system of health, and could be very easier broken by these diseases. But the other consequence is the social and economic of this COVID-19, because it can be an issue of food problem. Due to the lockdown measures, because coming from the rural areas, from the pastoral communities, that people depend from the daily life of the market. If they can't sell the product today, they can't eat tomorrow. And in all these regions, it's very impacted by the climate change. So we already are very vulnerable communities and hitting by two crises. Let me tell you, since 1 century, we have in Chad already 1.5 degree of the global warming. It's already well above the world average. And then the impact is very terrible in my communities and in all the Sahel regions, because people's fighting for the resources. Hanna said very well, I'm coming from these Lake Chad regions who dry up in 90% just in my lifetime, 30 years. And these shrinking natural resources lead to the conflict between farmers, pastoralists and fishermen, and all those peoples do not depend from the end of the month's salaries. They depend from the rainfall. And the season used to be our alliance, and now is turning to our enemies. Because if the rain come very heavy, it's ending by flood. If it's not come, ending by drought. End of the day, food securities and people have to fight among themselves. So those are the social consequences that we do have. I'm very scared because the COVID crisis and the climate crisis led our man and our youth outside of our communities. They go out tempted to leave the rural areas to fight hopes, jobs, money in the big cities in Africa, and sometimes cross the Mediterranean to the Europe. And the other consequence of this is the poverty that people's fighting to the natural resources-based conflict. And we are seeing that now in Burkina Faso, in Mali, in Niger. All the entire villages massacred. It can be the farmers' villages or pastoral villages. The communities who do not get access to the drinking water, to the clean drinking water in these 21st centuries, how they can be faced to the COVID crisis where you have to wash your hands 4 hours, every 4 hours a day. So for me, the climate consequence and the COVID crisis are hitting the most vulnerable and hitting those who are left behind because we do live in a rural and very remote areas. It's not only the case of indigenous communities in Chad, it's the case of all the indigenous communities across the world, because I'm having the discussions with my brothers and sisters in Amazon, where now the illegal logging is becoming the daily base in them land because people focusing on the COVID crisis. I think what is happening in the ground is very dangerous where we are living now. So the action needs to be taken. And I leave you for the second part to tell you which kind of action who can be very helpful for the rural communities, for the indigenous peoples around the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hindou, and we will come back to that and to the question of action. It's obviously, problem and action, we need to have them both in mind. And I think what's really important in what you were saying as well was the vividness with which you paint the reality that people are facing. And it's always, it's essential to bear that in mind. And as Raychelle was saying, the importance of people who wish to assist in these issues and problems, understanding what the realities are, which includes both what the problems are and what the latent capabilities are. Another thing that we need to do as we have this conversation is to be sort of working on different scales at the same time. There's the very local, the personal, the individual, understanding that, and there's the big picture. Margot, I want to turn to you for that, if you can, for some thoughts about, there seems to be an increase in zoonotic infections that are passed from animals to people. This pandemic is another example, the third this century, or maybe fourth this century, of a major such event. There's the climate change issue, which we've been hearing about. There's the relationship between that and the loss of biodiversity. And one could also say between climate change and the crisis of air pollution, which has been hitting so many countries. And then there's the geopolitics around all of this as well. And somehow, as we address the very local, we need to be addressing the global scale as well. Can you help us with a few thoughts through that maze?
Thank you very much. And I would like to say hello to my colleagues there on the panel and friends from before, and also all of you who are now listening and watching. I would like to say one thing about the crisis and also something about the politics of all this. And at the end, I have a short to-do list as usual. But actually what you have described very well so far is that we are dealing with three crises, you might say. And I think you also try to force the audience here to make an impossible choice.
Of course.
Because you cannot choose. We are in the current pandemic, the COVID crisis, and actually caused by one single species, and that is us as humans. And governments and at all levels, we are affected by this ongoing crisis, economically, socially, and of course from a health perspective. But we also know that climate change is becoming the effects of climate change are becoming even worse. If we for a long time in our part of the world, in the Arctic region, thought that this is affecting somebody else, somewhere else, and as we thought sometime in the future, not now, we have been taken out of that idea, because now actually the Arctic is warming up at a very rapid speed, and you know that the carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere now is the highest in 60 years. So we have to deal with the climate crisis. And I would call a third crisis, and that has already been mentioned by Peter and others, is a kind of a crisis in the shadow of the climate crisis, and that is environment. And I really think that all of these issues that are covered by the word environmental policy, that has to do with waste management, it has to do with water, of course, it has to do with the loss of biodiversity, and Peter mentioned that as well. We have to deal with these things because they are also part of the explanation why we experience these zoonoses, as they are called. And more than half of all the infectious diseases that hit us actually emerge from zoonosis. They come to us via animals, and they make up 75% of all the emerging diseases, infectious diseases. So those that we know the short names of, like Ebola, bird flu, MERS, SARS, the Nipah virus, the Zika virus, they are all zoonoses, and this one as well. So we have to look at what do we do with deforestation, with the loss of land that makes all these animals and insects and what have you come so much closer, so that they can actually create and transmit diseases to humans. So we have all of these crises ongoing at the same time. And prevention is better than cure, we know that, but what does it mean? And when we are in the middle of such a crisis as a pandemic, it's very hard to introduce these discussions about doing prevention. And it's difficult to talk about climate change, doing the right things there, and to discuss how to stop deforestation and land degradation as well. But we have to. Sooner or later, we have to discuss also a more holistic view on this. So I think, as we've heard, the motto now, the rallying call, is building back better. So how do we do that? Well, we start by redefining security. And that goes for the Security Council as well, because so far they have not even been able to agree on a ceasefire in order to stop a very, very dramatic spread of the pandemic in war situations. We have to stand up for multilateralism, engage, fund multilateralism, and also speak up for cooperation, including the organizations, international organizations we have. the World Health Organization being one. And as much as we also look at its shortcomings, we need organizations of that sort. We have to build resilience, as you have so eloquently already described on the panel here. And we have to start by getting our knowledge, building our knowledge from science, education, and research. And I think a crisis like this also demonstrates or unveils the horrible consequences of inequality between poor and rich countries, between men and women, between regions, between rural and urban areas. And we have to address that. If we want to build back better, we have to look at how to fight these inequalities. And we have to protect the environment. We also have to do environmental reforms, because otherwise we will not be able to build back better. And we have to fight in all of this for democracy, human rights, and freedom. And we are in this together, finally. Just a few words to say that we live on the most beautiful planet on Milky Way, and I think we can do better. We can build back better, and we must.
So thank you, Margot, and thank you for starting off the to-do list, because this is where I wanted to turn to now. And maybe I could begin with Raychelle Omamo from Kenya, Foreign Minister, as what you think, and this is also a question which is coming in from the online audience, asking what do you think are the top priorities for climate change policies moving forward now?
Well, if I look at it within my continent, within the African continent, I think the most crucial thing we have to be able to do is to democratize this idea of climate change, make it real and relevant in the lives of people. We must stop talking about it in abstract terms. It must make sense to that farmer in the field. It must make sense to the herdsman. It must make sense to that young boy who's living in the settlement. So first, let us change the language of climate change and make it digestible to the people who need to understand it and the people who need to work out the solutions. Secondly, we need to do the things that are the low-hanging fruits, things that our people can engage in easily. We need to reclaim our forests. We need to reclaim our waterways. We need to include environmental education, environmental issues into our education system. We need to do what Wangari Maathai told us many years ago, that saving the planet starts with the individual. And it is the aggregate of each individual's small actions that are going to change our world. We need to have a bottom-up approach. This thing called climate change is becoming too esoteric, too distant from those who we think we need to mobilize to change our planet. Secondly, we need to bring the issues of Africa onto the table, the issues of development, the issues of debt relief, the issues of debt sustainability, the issues of state capability. None of these things are going to make sense for us if we cannot draw a dividend from the climate change debate. We must be able to build those new industries. We must be able to engage in developing those new technologies. We cannot have a green revolution that looks like the past one, where the continent was left behind. What COVID-19 has shown us is that the continent can partner in innovation, that the continent can bring new ideas to the table, that Africans will no longer be left behind anymore. And if we're going to build a new world order, it must be one in which Africans partner on an equal plane with others, and that we too are able to bring our voices and the needs of our people to the table and have them understood so that holistic solutions moving forward can be found. And we must be able to bring the ordinary African to the table as an actor, not merely as a bystander in this dialogue.
I mean, part of what you're saying is reflecting what we were mentioning earlier, this need to be working on the different scales, both the very local and also the global. And I think you also emphasize the importance of awareness. And I'd like to ask Hanna, Tetteh, if I may, what do you think, what progress you see being made in Africa and perhaps also in the UN system in the understanding of climate change and in the understanding of its interrelationship with the other issues? I mean, just one thing quickly. When I talk about climate change, very often what I'm really meaning is climate change is a doorway through to understanding and perhaps acting on a whole set of other issues. Because to think of climate change as a purely environmental issue seems to me to be completely misled. Climate change is an issue of the economy, of society, of inequality, of health, as we have seen. It's an issue to do with gender relations. It's an issue to do with peace and conflict and human security. So one of the things about climate change, I think, and one of the reasons why it's grabbed many people's attention is because it does impact so many things. So in that sense, the climate change as an interactive, interconnected issue, what awareness do you see growing, if any? Or what is being done to get an understanding of this kind of way of thinking about climate change across in Africa and in the UN system?
Well, within the UN system, this is something that we have been thinking about and thinking differently about for quite a while now. So even with peace and security and conflict situations, we do what we call an integrated analysis, working with the United Nations Environment Programme and also working with UNDP in order to have an understanding of all of the factors that are influencing the conflict, so that when we go into peace building and mediation activities, we are engaging, looking at the issue through a variety of lenses, but especially taking into consideration what is happening in terms of the climate crisis, environmental degradation, and climate change. Now, because of that, as we engage with member states of the African Union, with the African Union itself, we're talking increasingly more and more about how do we deal with this particular issue, not just looking at it in terms of a conflict situation, but looking at all of the factors that are creating that situation in order that as we go through this process of mediation, developing a peace agreement, peace building, we also have those issues under consideration and we make sure that in our own programs with those particular countries coming out of conflict, it is reflected in our country programs to make sure that we are not just talking about it, we're not just analyzing it, but we are actually working with the member states to be able to build that kind of resilience. But it's important to remember that while the UN, with all of its expertise and all of its best efforts, can make information available to, in this case, more often than not, a government, we also need the government to be able to step up and begin to take those kind of actions by incorporating a climate lens into its own policy and making sure that in their own policy delivery and making sure that as they engage with their citizens, they, to use the expression that Raychelle used, they make the whole issue of climate and environmental change not as esoteric as we do when we're talking about it from a theoretical perspective. Because if we are not able to explain to our citizenry why we need to make these efforts, why we need to stop cutting down trees, why it's important to make sure that we think about the sustainability of our forests, why we need to also focus on making sure that we introduce, for instance, cooking practices that don't take advantage of the trees just because they're there, and then in a couple of years' time, they're no longer there. So all of these things have to be factored in the way in which we act when we implement at the country level. But from the perspective of, again, the UN peace building, peace and security section, we are at the moment focused on how we do this with our member states. What we need is a willingness of member states to also work with us to make sure that that can happen. But back to the point that I made at the beginning of my intervention, and because of this issue of investment in climate solutions, right now we have heard and we have seen that as a result of the climate crisis, there has been a lot of discussion within the context of the G20, within the international financial institutions, about how we have an effective response to COVID. We can also see that economies are in crisis, and we can see the predictions for the shrinking in economic growth, and also in some instances for a recession. What that tells us is that after this, the 2-3 years after this crisis, we're going to have a different environment as far as access to finance is concerned for some of these initiatives. And that's why I insist on the point that we should not look at the COVID crisis and the climate crisis as mutually exclusive. Within the UN, we don't. That's the reason why we want to see a response that focuses on building back better and building back for resilience, because that is how we get the best out of the situation and how we make sure that this time we don't just find ourselves responding, but proactively looking at taking the steps to make sure that we don't find ourselves in a situation where we are as vulnerable and as weak. Because for sure, as Margot mentioned in her contributions, UNEP indicates that at the moment we have changed 75% of the Earth's surface. We've essentially created a situation where nature has been backed into a corner. If we don't think of trying to work with nature and trying to respect the fact that there are other species on this planet, and this is an interconnected ecosystem, and we are not unique, and we depend on the health of that system to be able to survive ourselves, then we're going to find ourselves in a situation where a few years down the line, we probably might be in a situation like this, except perhaps even worse. Yeah. And I certainly hope it doesn't come to that, but it means that we have to think differently.
Thank you very much, Hanna. And can I just say quickly to the online audience that there's some time still in which questions can come in and they get processed by backroom staff and they appear on my iPad in front of me, and then I'm processing them again and passing them on. And Peter, there's one which I wanted to put to you, which is really reflecting on what Hanna just said in a way, which is that we're talking about complexity. And at the same time, we're kind of trying to keep things as simple and as vivid as we possibly can. But part of that complexity is when we come to after the pandemic, or in fact, when we come to tomorrow and work, right? We've got choices to be making. In the case of Sweden, the projections are that Swedish gross national income will take a dip, and that growth will not be as fast as it has been in the last few years. And so there are going to be very practical choices about resources that Sweden will have available for its 1% target for ODA. And Sweden has been one of the leaders in giving overseas development assistance for years now. What kind of choices are you beginning to think about and beginning to talk about? I'm not asking you to give away government policy or even policy making, but what kinds of choices are there being balanced up at the moment?
Well, I think the most important choices is about what are we doing. It is about using the resources we have in the most effective way and do it so that it will give return on tomorrow. And I think we have heard very good things from Kenya and Chad, for example, on the effects on that we do. For example, on the climate question. I think we are far too abstract when we're talking about this. We have to talk more in practice. What does it mean in reality on the ground for people and in the daily work? For example, if we have droughts and floods and locusts in Kenya, what can we do to make resilience in the long run to combat the climate change instead of using the money in the short run. So how could we use it to stop and prepare in the long run to use it smarter? And of course it will be a big debate in my country as well as in others. How can we use when we have less money in the future? How much can we use to help other countries, and how much should we use to local communities, for example, in Sweden? But my answer is that if we don't show that we are a society in the whole world, and I think this COVID-19 crisis is an extremely good example on that we are one world. It will come back. The problem will come back for us time and again if we don't work together and make solutions instead of just plaster on every result.
Put a band-aid. Yes, absolutely. And Hindou, if I turn to you now, then what does building back better mean? What are the choices that you would like to see prioritized?
Yeah, I mean, I think world need to stop acting in silo, responding in each crisis separately. So my first message is for the peace and security community. They will not bring peace and security if they cannot stop climate change, if they cannot invest on adaptations, resilience, need for the peoples. You know, today, the only support we get in the Sahel, it's first military, second humanitarian. But those two cannot bring hope to the youth. Remember that in these regions, we have more than 50% of the populations below 25 years old. So only soldiers and food supply cannot bring a perspective for futures. Second, a message for the development communities. They should not invest only in urban areas. Today, all the development aids are stopped in the big towns, but they left the most poorest and the most needed supports who are in the rural areas. And they can know development should stop and should be an alternative to the terrorism. Third, I think I would like to share with you what we are doing in very ground levels. Mm-hmm. I use a 3D and 2D participatory mapping, a tool who can help to put all the communities together, farmers, pastoralists, fishermen, indigenous communities, and local communities together. It helps us to map the natural resources, to better share the natural resources, and it can help us to mitigate the conflict and live in harmony with our nature. So, lastly, the world needs to understand living in harmony and going back, respect our nature, to know it's not everything that coming from factories, but everything coming from land, coming from waters, coming from rain, coming from rivers, coming from oceans. So if we respect all those resources, all this ecosystem, we can rebuild living in harmony with the nature. And that is what indigenous peoples know better. And we do that through our traditional knowledge. So respecting traditional knowledge and rights of indigenous peoples. Stop denying on science, putting science and traditional knowledge together, respecting them and investing on them. I think we can have a better futures and better resilience for our planet. Let me end by this. We know when the COVID-19 came, Europe came with billions of money injecting in the economy. US did the same. I think many countries did the same. In just 2 months, we have more than 3,000 billions in the tables they want to inject in the economies. But when it's come to the climate change, just to having 100 millions a year for developing countries, it's become a big fight. So why the world cannot become to the solidarities and build all together? If it is emergency, climate is emergency. So we can act as the same behaviors of solidarities and resolve those issues. So believe on us, believe on indigenous peoples, believe on science, invest right now. We can have the better futures for all. Thank you.
Hindou, thank you so much. And I think also for, again, stressing this point. I mean, yes, indeed, we need to be practical. Yes, indeed, we need to be less abstract. But we should not be afraid of the big thought. And the big thought is that we are a part of nature and we have messed that up and we need to get that right. Margot, I want to come to you now and I want to go back to the very first point that Hindou just made. And I hope you will understand the reason for this as I say it. She said that it was a message to the security community that you will not bring peace and security if climate change is not stopped. And we're working together now on a quite ambitious project, which will take us a couple of years to develop a new initiative and a new report. And you have accepted to be chair of the panel that is delivering this initiative. So tell us something about the Environment of Peace, which is the name of this initiative.
Yeah, it's called the Environment of Peace, and I'm very proud to be asked to chair an international panel. And I'm happy to welcome also Hindou on the panel. And with this initiative, we are trying to fit all of these pieces together. And the project will do research. This will be knowledge-based, and we will use some of the best researchers and experts to help us write up a report. It will do ideas so that we can come up with ideas that are really usable for national governments and organizations and different partners. We will speak to decision makers and also policy makers at all levels, so that this can serve almost like a handbook for them to transmit this into political actions. And so we are hoping that this will really inform governments and the UN and local communities as well. And we will also do a follow-up so that we can do training, that we can make sure that these ideas are fully used by people around the world. And the thing is that unless we do something about the environment, we will see maybe a pandemic or a virus outbreak of this kind every year. And you can imagine the costs of that from a human health perspective, from an economic and social perspective. We cannot afford that. But all these viruses that we've seen, the zoonosis we've seen, they are all linked to human activity. So we can also do something about it, as we've heard from the panelists. And we have a lot to do, and I think that this will be an amazing challenge, an amazing task to try to tie these different elements together, because we can also see clearly that security, human security, is not only about military security, but it is really about human security. It's about making sure that we avoid climate change effects that will actually lead to social unrest and in the end can lead to armed conflicts as well, or to see environmental degradation to such a point where we will have another pandemic soon again, or other effects of this type. So that's what we want to do.
So, I mean, I think that what we see in front of us is the possibility that these interacting elements lead us into really the nightmare. As Hanna was saying, let us hope not, but there is the possibility that in a few years' time there is something worse. But also a recognition of those risks and a recognition of those interactive points means we're beginning to develop a clearer idea about what to do, about what the issues are that need to be addressed and how they relate to each other. Raychelle, Omamo, there's a question actually coming, as far as I can see, from it's from East Africa, from your region. I'm not sure which country, but it's about working together on linked up policies. It's important both that the initiatives are not in silos and also that the actors are not in silos. So can you tell us a little bit about initiatives for cooperation on linked up approaches to these issues?
Oh, I totally agree. One thing about the challenges that emanate from climate change is that they're cross-border. They are issues that one country cannot deal with by itself. So it's essential to cooperate at regional level, to cooperate at continental level, and also to cooperate internationally. Within our region, if we look at the challenge, say, for example, of locusts, we have had to bring this matter to the attention of IGAD and to try and get IGAD to mobilize us together so that we can have a harmonization of policies and a harmonization of action. You cannot deal with locusts in one part of the region and expect that you'll sleep easy on the other side of the region. The same thing with flooding, the same thing with drought, and so on. What is critical, though, is for us to be able to work in concert regionally, to form strong regional mechanisms, for instance, to deal with, cross-border water bodies, for example. In our region, we have Lake Victoria, and we have to begin to treat that as a shared resource. Once we begin to look at things as shared resources, then we then are able to harmonize our interests. As long as we see our forests, our rivers as belonging to one nation or belonging to one place, we will not be able to find those solutions that bring us together and will not be able to focus on a united way forward. Before I finish, may I also add another dimension? I think we need to activate women as front runners in climate change mitigation. We have seen this in our countries. The people who are most ready to engage in tree planting, those who are most ready to engage in building dikes and so on, are women. And we need to be able to understand that the first victims of resource conflicts, the first peoples that are displaced by rivers that are broken their banks are women. So we need to integrate women into this fight. Ensure that they engage not as bystanders but as leaders. So just like my colleague from Sweden indicated, that you have to bring everybody on board, and you have to see climate change as mitigation and the threat itself as multifaceted, engaging on many issues on many fronts, be it inequality, be it vulnerability of human beings, be it issues pertaining to state capability, be it issues pertaining to building bridges across the region. Like our colleague from Chad has said, we have to be able to show the same solidarity that we are seeing in fighting COVID-19 in the fight against climate change. It is so easy because climate change doesn't move quickly that we assume that its impacts are not serious. But when flooding occurs, thousands are displaced, thousands die. And that's when we wake up to its reality, fix the situation, and then wait until the next time an incident occurs. So we have to maintain consistency. And it's that consistency is generated through collective action that is regional, that's continental, and that's global. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Raychelle. I just want to say about this question of women, which has come up a couple of times now, right? And we have 4 out of 5 panelists are women. And so far as I know, there was no actual effort to choose or to select a panel that was a majority of women. What actually was done was to set out to find 4 very good speakers to be panelists, to speak eloquently and with knowledge, and so happens that 4 were women. So I think that what you're saying is true, that we are seeing women come through very strongly, not just on the climate change issue, not just on environmental issues, but on a whole range of issues. Women's leadership is coming through much more clearly. And a friend of mine pointed out, and I'm not sure what the evidence will in the end show, but that several of the governments which seem to have performed best in the pandemic have been led by women, quite a few, even though very few governments are actually led by a woman head of government. And some of those governments which have performed most spectacularly badly on COVID-19 seem to have been led by men. So there is something which is happening in the change of politics. I want to come to one question to ask quite quickly to both Peter and Hanna, and then come to all 5 of you with a final question. And it's this, it's something which has been picked up before, and maybe Hanna first, then Peter. It's been mentioned before. Is it possible, how is it possible to get politicians, political leaders, to treat the climate change issue with the same degree of urgency as both the COVID-19 issue has been treated in most places, and as the disasters that climate change from time to time produces get treated? How can we get that long-term effort made at the appropriate level, which I think we pretty much all agree is a much more intense and higher level than the one that we have seen in the last few years? Can I start with you, Hanna Tetteh in Addis?
You need to put the science and the facts right in front of their faces in such a way that the evidence is undeniable. And then you also need to mobilize domestic constituencies to have the same facts and evidence in front of their faces. Because the fact of the matter is that politicians respond to the electorate more often than not, where you have any real semblance of a democracy. And I used to be a politician myself some years ago when Margot and I were both serving together as foreign ministers. And one of the jokes I used to make to my colleagues was that it's the most demand-driven profession in the world. You actually, it is the things that matter to the people who you rely on for their growth that actually you prioritize, unless you have a medium to long-term goal. Now, you can see leaders who are thoughtful, who look at the science, who look at the facts, who make sure that the things that they do are evidence-based. And you can see the leaders who respond to the spur of the moment. For the leaders who respond to the spur of the moment, you've got to make this evidence and this message something that is inassailable, cannot be argued against, so that there is the compulsion to be able to move forward. When we had the Paris Agreement, and there were the nationally determined commitments that we're supposed to implement over a period of 20 years, in some of the discussion, you had the sense that people were going through the motions, but they didn't really think this was something that they were going to have to implement. Well, it's important that initiatives like that are treated as initiatives that you are going to have to implement. Because if you know that you're going to have to implement it, you think about how you're going to do it. I think that from the point of view of organizations like the United Nations, the development world, the imperative now is on us to be able to make the evidence available and to make it available and break it down in such a way that the connections are clear. Because if we are unable to do so, then that will be a failure on our part. Then it means that we wouldn't have done enough to be able to make the world know that this is where we are. These are the things that we've got to do, and this is how we are going to get it done. And there's one point I just want, if you allow me, I just wanted to make a point on one of the things that Raychelle said. Yes, we definitely have to have more women who are engaged in matters of this nature. It's also important that women who have the opportunity to serve in government, around the cabinet table, when there are no cameras, when it is just you and probably 70% of the room is men, and maybe there's, if you are lucky, on the African continent, 30% of the room is women, that you are better informed, that you are able to articulate better, that you are able to make the argument in terms of what policy should be prioritized and funded, so that your presence within government makes a difference, because that is what will make an impact in the continent and I suppose all over the world.
Thank you so much, Hanna. And Peter, the same question to you. Getting the climate crisis treated with the same kind of sense of urgency and intensity that we've seen over other issues?
Well, you can have a lot of answers on that. It's not the easy thing. Then we would have had it already, and that's not the question. One easy answer is, of course, you have to vote for people that are prepared to do something in this direction, but and that goes for democracies, if they are going to vote for that kind of people, we need open societies, we need information that is good, a free press, and we need people that have knowledge, and that is the basic thing for development overall. And also in many countries that are not fully democracies, I would say corruption is the biggest answer. If we get rid of corruption, we can solve a lot of other questions, because this thing is a hinder for development in many cases, and also in the climate change question.
Yeah. Thank you so much, and thank you everybody. I now have one last question which I want to put to you, but with Margot and Hindou, I allow, if you manage to be quick, that you include the extra point that you each wanted to make. Right. So the question is, I want to ask each panelist, I want to challenge you in a way, what is the one thing that you would like to either see done or will do now on these issues that we have been talking about? So just one priority thing that you think would be making a difference. But Margot, as I said, a special allowance for you, because you did indicate that there was an additional point you wanted to make. So you first, and then we'll go through the panelists in the reverse order from which we started and finish with Peter. Margot, first.
We understand that one single nation will not be able to fight a pandemic on its own. We understand we are in this together, so we have to argue for and engage in and speak well about multilateral cooperation, regional and cooperation at the UN level, and that it starts with that. But then I really want to see reforms that create resilience. And as I said, you have to take away the inequalities that exist today, because otherwise we will get nowhere. I wanted to say one short thing about that $1 million question you just asked. How come that decision makers do not follow the scientific advice that we have now received in consecutive reports from the IPCC, from the panel with all our leading experts on climate change? And it is really, you can give an easy answer: self-interest, economic interests, because they are threatened with the actions necessary. But really, it's maybe also we need to call on the behavioral experts to help us to deal with it. And with the pandemic, the thing is, we have a picture of what it is. What this virus is, we've even seen them. They are like small slimy balls with sort of suckers on them, and we can picture them. But with climate change, we have not been able to get an image of an enemy that we have to fight down. But it has always been seen as something that will happen maybe later on and does not affect us, but really the rest of the world only. So I think those things are the most important.
Thank you so much, Margot, and thank you for your contribution all through. Hindou.
Thank you. My one priority is to find back the wisdom of my grandmother. Nature should not be our enemy. Nature should be our alliance. And that what Indigenous peoples know the best, we are still using our traditional medicine through our nature, our environment. And we are still adapting to climate change, even it's very hard by our traditional knowledge. So the leaders, the world leaders should remember Indigenous people's knowledge, and peoples on grounds have the solutions. They must be listened and being in the tables. And don't forget that women are the one who play the bigger role in all our world transformations. And thank you for all the opportunities.
Hindou, thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure to listen to you. Raychelle, Omamo, so you're, if you accept the challenge, one major priority that needs to be done?
Solidarity. Because of the confluence of threats, you have to work together, you have to think together, and you have to be brave enough to find the new solutions. Our problem is that we know what needs to be done, but we don't have the courage to sacrifice to get the job done. And the only way in which we'll get the job done is if in our fears, we hold hands together and work together as one. Solidarity is imperative.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And Hanna, Tetteh, over to you.
I think it's important, and I made the point at the beginning, we should work at solving the COVID crisis at the same time as we work on solving the climate crisis. We cannot deal with them as separate issues. We must deal with them as issues that we must deal with that have to be addressed together. And we have to make sure that in all of these discussions that we are having, after we leave these platforms and we've had the benefit of exchanging views, that they inform the things that we are going to do going forward. That we don't just talk about it, but we actually do it. And we have a commitment to make it happen. It's when people commit to make things happen that change happens. And I believe that we can make change if we want to.
Thank you so much, Hanna, and thank you for your contribution all through this afternoon. Peter.
I would say that, as I said in the beginning, investments are shaping the future. And investments together with people will form our future together. And if we go on investing in the destructive things like oil and instead of trees and restoration of forest and investing in big industry, agriculture in Amazonas and in areas where it's not shaped for that, we have to realize that it will not work. We have to change the investment strategies in the whole world to go on sustainability instead of destruction. And that is the big task for the universe or for the people on Earth to do. And if we manage that, then we have a possibility to create a world that is a fantastic, a beautiful world together.
So I want to thank you all five, and Peter again to thank the Foreign Ministry for the cooperation in bringing this on. It's been a tremendously rich session. We've heard so much from ground level, from the world order, what we need, philosophy, projects, future activities. I just want to say a few of what my takeaways are, and then I'm sure everybody else in this very well-informed online audience has their own takeaways. First of all, something which I also said yesterday, and it's something that has become a little bit of a kind of a refrain for me, which is that resilience, one of the reasons why resilience is fungible from one activity to another is because it's based on knowledge and on cooperation. And I think so much of what I have been hearing this last hour and 25 minutes from five really well-qualified people to be talking about it is about the importance of evidence. So what did Foreign Minister of Kenya say? Put it in front of their faces so that they can't deny it. What did we talk about? We talked about awareness of how things are on the ground, about science and traditional knowledge. And so I think knowledge is just fundamental to this. But cooperation also. We are being told by our experience that if we do not cooperate, we will really suffer. So if we want to thrive, we must be planning to thrive together. The second thing which I pick up out of this is the whole issue that has been raised about the convergence of the different risks. What I think is interesting about this is that on the one hand, one can draw out the nightmare of what happens if we have yet a worse pandemic, one which is as infectious as COVID-19, but more virulent with higher mortality rates. What happens if we have a cyber crash for half of Europe in the middle of such a pandemic? What goes on then? We can draw out all the nightmares that we want from these interacting risks and problems that we face. But also, because they're interacting, we can also figure out that there are ways in which if we work on one, we work on the other simultaneously. If we work on the environment in some contexts, we're contributing to building peace. If we're contributing to building peace in some contexts, we will be contributing to economic improvement. If we're contributing to economic improvement, we can do that through gender empowerment and through more inclusive, more egalitarian policies. So these issues, just as the problems work together, so do the solutions work together. And a third thing, which I think I want to pull out from here, from the discussions we've been hearing, is perhaps it's almost a cliche in disaster risk reduction. It is that when you think about natural disasters, recovery always happens. It can be the worst earthquake, but there will be recovery afterwards of a kind. There can be the worst flood, the worst hurricane, the worst drought, but there will be recovery afterwards of a kind. Why? Because it must happen. Because if people are there after the flood, through the drought, after the disaster, they will work together, they will pick themselves up, they will survive somehow. Some will anyway. So recovery happens because it must happen. And why does preparation against the day not happen? Because it doesn't have to happen. Right? That is the psychological barrier that we have to get ourselves as individuals, as communities, as organizations, as research institutes, as governments, as international organizations. That's the psychological barrier we have to get over. Preparation, we need to understand, must happen because it must happen. Without that, we will face the disaster. And then I think, I don't know, maybe the most important thing that comes out of this afternoon on top of all of that is make it real. Let us really get clear what the real effects are of the problems which we're allowing to build. But also make it real. Let's get a clearer understanding of all the things which are already being done, which address the problems, and of all the things that could be done. So with that, I want again to thank our 5 panelists. I think it has been a very, very rich discussion, as I said. And I want to invite you back. I want to invite you back tomorrow. There will be a panel at the same time on building peace in the time of COVID-19, where we will be hearing from, amongst others, the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, the former Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations, Jan Eliasson, 2 foreign ministers, 1 current and 1 former Under-Secretary General of the UN, and the Secretary General of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Oh, I'm sorry, and me. I'll be there too. So welcome back tomorrow afternoon at the same time. Thanks very much for watching.
Thank you.